Hey again, thanks for tuning back in. So as I talked about at the end of my second or third video, part 2 Twisted Cube, I had worked with an old piece of Doug fir to make the tri-corner bowl. Like I said, this was the original failed, well, not really, it wasn't particularly failing until I realized that I was succeeding, and then I realized I had a bunch of cracks in this cube, this old piece, and so I thought, well, let me start over again with a piece of wood that doesn't look like it's going to crack up on me, and that was the cube that I produced. Now, like I mentioned at the end of the video, this Doug fir doesn't have a great grain structure to put a nice finish on to show off grain, so I thought I'd paint it, and so I reached into the old art supplies from my the kid closet, and pulled out this jar of acrylic enamel, blue. It's called Gloss Sea Blue. I shook it up and I just started to paint the inside of that bowl, and it was a beautiful, deep, dark blue. And I painted the inside of the bowl, and then I put it down to dry. Came back a little later to paint the outside of the bowl. I dipped the brush deeper into the jar and came back up, and when I started to paint, it was a different color. It was a lighter blue. What I like what's on the cover or the top of the jar of paint, which I hadn't really paid much attention to. I liked the very deep dark blue. Blue's one of my favorite colors. I kind of said, well, I'll paint it blue. So what I realized is that I guess the zinc oxide had separated down to the bottom of the jar. When I shook it, it didn't come up into solution and create the color. It was a separated, darker blue. But when I put those two blues together, that dark, deep blue and the lighter blue, all of a sudden something sparked. I had a little epiphany, and I was reminded of a favorite piece of art of mine, and actually my son's in particular, and it's called The Great Wave off Kanagawa, Japanese piece of art, and well, I'll show it to you. Anyway, so then I thought, well, let me see if I can kind of do an homage to the Great Wave. And so let's see. So the deep dark blue is what first came out of that jar, and then that lighter blue with those little swoops right there, that's the lighter actual color of this paint is supposed to be. And then so I just sort of I took a quick look at that painting, The Great Wave off Kanagawa, and sort of tried to do a little bit of a design like that, and I was fairly pleased with the way this came out. It was pretty, I liked it, but it got me thinking, well, is there a way that I could turn a bowl, create a piece of stock to turn that would somehow provide me swoops here that look more like waves. Somehow curving, and I thought, well, curving the cube, twisting the cube, right? So if that sounds familiar, that's where the title came from. So if I could somehow twist the edges of the cube so that the three corners that create the three-corner bowl somehow kind of turn, then maybe that would give me the shape that I wanted. And I thought, well, how could I do that? So if I had slices, I could then glue them together in a twist and then see how that worked out. And so that's what I attempted to
do. So I needed to decide on the thickness of the slices to build up the cube, and what material. So I hopped online and went to Home Depot and found Hobby Board. And I settled in on, this is 1/4 inch thick stock, this particular is walnut, and I decided on 5.5 inches, figuring that a 5.5 inch cube would be the right size to do this project. So I grabbed my materials and headed home. With the wood in hand, I set up my miter saw and to cut 5.5 inch lengths, and again, some fairly simple math. 5.5 divided by 0.25 inches is 22 layers. That's how many I'm going to need to build this cube. And in fairly short order, I had my stack of layers, and so then the next thing was just to figure out how to twist it. I knew I was going to need 90 degrees, a full 90-degree turn, because you want to have the same alignment of corners as you have in a standard cube for turning it on the lathe. I tried the twist by eye, and it became kind of obvious that you could get one end fine. It was going to take a lot of jockeying around continuously to try and make sure you had all of the alignments right. So I figured I needed to do a little bit of calculation, a little bit of math, so I could put reference marks on the layers to align them correctly. So if these calculations don't interest you, you can fast forward about 2 minutes. But so as I said, the hobby boards are 1/4 inch thick by 5.5 inches, and so that took 22 layers to build up the cube. And the top layer and the bottom layer will be lined on top of each other, and so there's really only 21 spacings in the 90-degree twist I want to make, so that's actually 4.3 degrees for each turn of a board. So as the boards rotate around their centers at that 4.3 degrees, you can see that the distance from edge to edge of each board, of course, is going to be identical. But as intuition might lead you to think that you could just divide the board by those 21 spaces, that doesn't turn out to be the case. You can see here that those distances inside the angle are not the same. So if we use a little bit of geometry and trigonometry, though, we can figure out this distance for proper marking for alignment. I'm going to summarize these next calculation steps pretty quickly. If this sort of thing, again, interests you, please pause and you can double check me. I'm always up for that. But again, if math isn't your thing, just jump on the fast forward button. The first useful dimension to calculate is the distance from the center of the square, which of course is also the center of rotation, to the corner of the square. This can be seen as the hypotenuse of a right triangle, the length of whose legs are half the width of the square. This hypotenuse is also the effective radius of the rotation and is easily calculated using the Pythagorean theorem, square root of the sum of the squares of the leg lengths. Then projecting right triangles based on the 4.3 degree rotation step and applying some trigonometry, we determine one leg of the new right triangle, which includes our dimension of interest as its hypotenuse, and of course we will quite predictably refer to this distance as x. Now, using the rules of opposite and adjacent angles, we determine a second angle within this right triangle, and that gives us all we need to plug into our last bit of trigonometry to find x. The distance from one board edge to the next is approximately 200 mils, or 2/10 of an inch. Armed with this information, I went to start marking off my boards. So initially, I thought I was going to need to make a mark at all 4 corners of each of the layers. Then I realized that if these are really pretty close to squares, then in theory I should only really need to mark 2 of the corners. So that's what I did. And I put 2 marks on each of those corners, one on the side and one on the top, so I could have a good reference from 2 different angles of view. So then stacking them up for a trial run, I found that it worked out pretty well. I had a pretty good 90-degree angle at the one end. You can see that all the spaces aren't worked out exactly here, but it did turn out pretty darn well in terms of being 90 degrees to each of the corners, and so that should give me the same 2 corners to put into the lathe as you'd have with a standard cube for the tricorner bowl. Now along the way I thought, well, maybe another marking would be a helpful thing to just keep your eye on, so I ran my pencil down the edges while it was in the twisted configuration to give me another reference point. With all the marks in place, the only thing left to do was glue up all of the layers. Initially I thought I would attempt to glue them all at once, but it became obvious as I went along that as I was working on layers up the stack, the ones below kind of tended to move around a little bit, and I had to keep jockeying things around. And then I got about halfway through and just sort of realized that there was that, and there was also the fact that I was a little worried the glue wasn't going to be nicely spread and set between the layers with the amount of time it was taking me to get this together. So I decided to vise up half the way through and let that half set and then begin again. Gluing up the second half of the stack went much as the first. Again, some jockeying back and forth between the lower layers and the upper layers, much as the first half. When I got to vicing this up, though, the slippage got particularly worse, and I had to go to some extremes to try and provide some even pressure on the stack. So once the stack was basically done drying, I got a little worried about the corners. There wasn't a lot of glue squeeze out on any of the corners, and I was a little worried that they were not really well adhered to each other. So I decided to hit it up with some CA glue, just to try and then vice them back up to, and that stuff stinks a lot, so pull the air away. Vice up those corners to get them to be nice and stable. And in the end, I was pretty satisfied with the final result, and so the only thing was to take it to the lathe.